The alarm ripped through my archive chamber, at the third hour of night rotation, and I knocked a stack of Braille translation cylinders off my desk, reaching for the communicator. The face on the screen was not my assistant. It was not my department head. It was High Commander Chirek Voss himself, all 6 eyes blinking in that rapid pattern the Braille use when their nervous system is flooded with cortical stress hormones. "Archivist Keelan," he said. "War chamber. Now." The channel closed before I could ask a single question. I stood in the blue dark of my office on Solaris Prime, surrounded by 14,000 years of gathered history, and I felt something cold settle into my chest. In 40 years of service, as senior archivist of the Confederacy of United Species, no one from the military had ever contacted me directly. I cataloged old things. I translated dead languages. I argued about the meaning of cave paintings at academic symposiums, where half the audience fell asleep. I was not a man who received calls from the commander of the largest warfleet in the known galaxy at the third hour of night rotation. I dressed and moved through the corridors of the Central Authority complex, my footsteps echoing against the polished stone. Solaris Prime never truly slept. The capital world of 12 spacefaring species hummed with constant activity, diplomats and trade officials and military liaisons flowing through its halls at every hour. But tonight the hallways felt different. I passed clusters of uniformed officers walking fast, speaking low. Twice I saw runners, actual runners, sprinting through connecting passages with sealed data cases clutched against their chests. Something had happened, and whatever it was had bypassed every normal chain of communication and gone straight to the top. The war chamber occupied the deepest level of the Central Authority. A vast circular room, lined with sensor displays and tactical projections. I had been inside it exactly once in my career, during an orientation tour. Now, as the doors opened and I stepped through, I understood why Chirek Voss had called me personally. All 12 high representatives were present, every single one. The insectoid Vrael delegation filled one arc of the curved table, their chitinous bodies clicking with involuntary stress responses. The aquatic Dothuri ambassador, Prelate Morris, sat in his hydration cradle, with his gill membranes fluttering at twice their normal rate. The crystalline Cytheri representative, Ambassador Christ, had gone almost completely opaque, which I knew from my studies meant she was experiencing something her species had no emotional framework to process. Even the gaseous Alon delegate was present, contained in a pressure sphere near the ceiling, their luminous form pulsing with agitation. 12 species, 12 representatives, every military commander from 6 active fleets, and me, a historian who spent his days in a basement reading things that were older than most civilizations. Archivist Keelan. Chirek Voss stood at the center of the room, towering over the assembled delegates at nearly 3 meters tall. His thorax plates had taken on the dark crimson coloring that Vrael biology produced under extreme duress. "Thank you for responding quickly. We have a situation that falls outside every operational framework this body possesses, and your expertise has been identified as the only relevant resource available to us." "My expertise," I said carefully, "is in pre-Confederacy history, specifically in textual analysis of mythological and proto-historical records from the expansion era." "We know what your expertise is," said Prelate Morris from his cradle, his translated voice carrying the wet harmonic undertone characteristic of Dothuri speech. "That is precisely why you are here." I felt my pulse quicken. My expertise. My very specific, very ridiculed expertise. The thing that had made me the quiet joke of every academic conference for 2 decades. I studied the Terran hypothesis. Every archivist knew about it. Most dismissed it as folklore analysis, the academic equivalent of chasing atmospheric reflections across a swamp. But I had built my entire career on a single persistent anomaly in the historical record. At least 4 species, separated by thousands of light years and thousands of years of independent development, had produced strikingly similar descriptions of an unknown species. The Vrael texts called them the soft ones who broke worlds. The Dothuri oral histories named them the drowning fire. The Cytheri had carved references into cave walls 14,000 years ago, calling them myth flesh. The Alon had songs about them, ancient vibration patterns that translated roughly as, "those who walk through endings." The descriptions were consistent to a degree that made independent invention almost impossible. Bipedal, endoskeletal, carbon-water biology originating from a high-gravity world with a toxic atmosphere and a wildly unstable climate. They were described as small, fragile, and utterly relentless. Their ships, according to every source that mentioned them, bled light. Their warriors refused to stay dead, and then, at some point in the ancient past, they simply vanished. Every reference stopped, every trail went cold, as if an entire civilization had been erased from the galaxy, or had erased itself. I had spent 20 years arguing that these references pointed to a real species. I had cross-referenced linguistic patterns, carbon-dated artifacts, mapped the geographic distribution of Terran myths across the spiral arms, and published paper after paper that was cited primarily as an example of how intelligent people could waste their talents on nonsense. My colleagues called me the man who chases ghosts. Now I stood in a room full of the most powerful beings in the Confederacy, and every single one of them was looking at me, as if I held the answer to something that terrified them. Keurig Voss activated the central display without preamble. A holographic projection filled the space above the table, showing a star map of the galaxy's outer rim. One region was highlighted in red, a vast swath of space that every species knew and every species avoided. The exclusion boundary. It stretched across nearly 8% of the galaxy's circumference, a region where ships that entered did not return. Navigation hazard, gravitational anomalies, sensor distortion fields. Every species had a different explanation for why the boundary existed, and every species had the same policy regarding it. Stay away, do not enter, do not investigate. 11 days ago, Keurig Voss said, a Vrail deep survey probe crossed the exclusion boundary during a routine sensor calibration sweep. The probe was operating on autonomous protocols and drifted past the threshold before course correction could be applied. He paused. His mandibles clicked 3 times in rapid succession, a Vrail expression I had never seen from a high commander. It meant something between dread and awe. The probe transmitted for 14 minutes before signal loss. For the first 11 minutes, the data was unremarkable. Standard spatial readings consistent with empty deep space. No anomalies. No gravitational distortion. Nothing that would explain why every ship that enters that region disappears. He touched a control, and the holographic display shifted. Sensor data scrolled across the projection, dense columns of numbers that meant nothing to most of the people in the room. At the 11-minute mark, the probe's instruments registered a gravitational distortion event on a scale that exceeds any phenomenon in our databases. Energy signatures appeared across every measurable spectrum simultaneously, drive emissions of a type that matches no known propulsion technology, and in the final 4 seconds before the probe was destroyed, it captured this. The display changed to visual feed. The image was grainy, distorted by interference, but it was clear enough. Shapes, vast shapes, moving through the dark in precise formation. They were not asteroids. They were not spatial phenomena. They were ships, thousands of them, and they were moving toward Confederate space. The room was silent. I could hear the faint hum of Prelate Maurice's hydration system cycling. I could hear the crystalline resonance of Ambassador Christ's body vibrating at a frequency that meant fear. Archivist Kalen, Keurig Voss said, and his voice had dropped to a register I had never heard from a Vrail before. We need you to analyze the energy signatures captured by the probe and compare them against your archive. They gave me a workstation. I sat down and began running the probe's energy data against every record in my collection. The archive I had spent 2 decades building, the one that occupied a sub-basement nobody visited, the one my colleagues mocked at conferences and funding committees, threatened to defund every fiscal cycle. I ran the signatures against Vrail military records first, then Dothuri naval databases, then Sci-Theory geological surveys, then Alun atmospheric readings. Nothing matched. Then I ran them against the old records, the pre-Confederacy records, the things carved into stone and pressed into clay and encoded in crystal matrices that predated spaceflight for half the species in this room. I ran the probe's energy signatures against a Sithiri cave painting that was 14,000 years old, a painting that showed ships descending on a world with energy readings carved into the stone beside them, in mathematical notation, that no living theory could explain, because it used a numbering system their species had abandoned 12,000 years ago. The match came back at 94.6%. I stared at the screen. My hands were trembling. I became aware, slowly, that the entire room had gone quiet in a way that felt physical, as if the air itself had stopped moving. I looked up from the workstation. 12 high representatives, 6 fleet commanders, the combined military and political leadership of every known civilization in the galaxy, all of them watching me, all of them waiting. I said one sentence, and I heard my own voice crack as I said it. They are real. No one spoke, no one moved. Chirrut Voss closed his outer eyes, leaving only his deep-set combat pair open, a Vrael reflex that their species had evolved for moments when the world became too dangerous to process with full sensory input. Prelate Morris was the first to break the silence. How certain are you? 94.6% signature match to a Sci-Theory primary source dating to 14,000 years before present. Cross-referenced against Vrael military logs from the same era that describe identical energy patterns. Cross-referenced against Dothuri oral histories that contain mathematical descriptions of drive emissions, matching the probe data within acceptable margins of cultural translation error. I paused and forced my hands to stop shaking. This is not a natural phenomenon. This is not an unknown species. This is the species that every old text in my archive describes. The ones who bled light. The ones who broke worlds. They are coming, and based on the formation density and trajectory data from that probe, they will reach the exclusion boundary in approximately 40 standard rotations. Ambassador Christ made a sound I had never heard a Cythery produce. It was low, resonant, and it passed through my bones like a vibration from deep underground. Later, I learned it was a prayer. The Cythery had not prayed in 6,000 years. How many ships? Chirrut Voss asked. I looked at the sensor data again. I ran the numbers twice because the first result seemed impossible. Based on formation density and the sensor window available, the probe detected a minimum of 6,000 distinct vessel signatures before it was destroyed. The formation was still expanding at the edge of the sensor range when contact was lost. The actual number is likely significantly higher. 6,000 ships, the entire Confederate combined fleet, every warship from every species pooled together, numbered just over 3,000. And the number I had given them was a floor estimate from 4 seconds of visual data. Chirrut Voss looked at me across the war chamber, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in the eyes of a Vrael High Commander. What do your old texts say about them, Archivist? What do the myths tell us about what they want? I thought about every fragment I had ever translated. Every cave painting, every clay tablet, every crystal-encoded memory from species that had encountered these beings 14,000 years ago, and been so profoundly affected that the experience became part of their foundational mythology. The myths disagree about many things, I said. Their appearance, their motivations, their technology. But every single source, across every species, agrees on one point. Which is? Do not make them angry. The Confederate Combined Fleet assembled at the edge of the exclusion boundary in 36 standard rotations, 4 days ahead of my projected timeline for contact. 2,200 warships from 9 species, hastily pulled from patrol routes and border stations and training exercises across the galaxy. It was the largest military mobilization in Confederate history, and it was not enough. I knew it was not enough. Everyone in the fleet knew it was not enough. But it was what we had. I stood on the observation deck of the Vrael flagship Mandate of Chirrut, watching the fleet arrange itself into defensive formations across a front that spanned nearly 2 light-years of space. The sight should have been impressive. 9 species, putting aside centuries of trade disputes and territorial grievances, and cultural friction to present a unified front against an unknown threat. Under any other circumstances, it would have been the most significant moment of cooperation in Confederate history. But I had seen the probe data. I had counted the shapes in that 4-second window of distorted footage, and I could not stop my mind from doing the arithmetic. 2,200 ships against a minimum of 6,000. Those were not the odds of a battle. Those were the odds of a demonstration. 3 species had refused to send ships. The Kelvari claimed the sensor data was inconclusive. The Threshold Collective argued that the exclusion boundary had been stable for thousands of years, and saw no reason to assume that would change. The Dothuri ambassador, Prelate Morris, had publicly called the entire mobilization fabricated hysteria before his own government overruled him and sent 40 frigates without his approval. 2 additional species were quietly evacuating their border colonies, moving civilian populations toward the galactic core without making any public announcements. The Confederacy was built for trade disputes and resource negotiations. It was built for the kind of problems that could be solved with committees and economic sanctions and strongly worded diplomatic resolutions. It was not built for this. I watched the political machinery of 12 civilizations grind against a situation it was never designed to handle, and I saw it beginning to crack. I had been given the title of cultural advisor and assigned quarters aboard the Mandate of Chirek with full military clearance and access to every classified database the Confederate military maintained. This was not because anyone believed a historian would be useful in a military engagement. It was because I was the only person in the Confederacy who had spent 2 decades studying the very thing that was now approaching our border, and nobody else had any idea what to do with me. On the 4th day after the fleet reached position, I was deep in the classified archives when I found something that changed my understanding of everything. My public archive contained references to the unknown species from 4 civilizations, 4 sets of myths, 4 collections of ancient texts, 4 independent cultural traditions that described the same beings. This was the foundation of the Terran hypothesis, the body of evidence I had spent my career analyzing and defending. The classified archives contained references from 9 civilizations. 5 governments had been suppressing Terran-related materials for centuries, classifying them under designations that ranged from destabilizing cultural content to existential security concern, category absolute. The Vrael military had an entire department dedicated to monitoring and containing references to the unknown species. The Cytheri government had sealed 3 archaeological sites that contained Terran artifacts, buried them under restricted access orders, and removed them from every public geological survey. I sat in my quarters reading classified documents that should have been part of my archive for 20 years, and I felt a strange mixture of vindication and fury. I had been right. I had been right about everything, and the people who had mocked me, who had denied me funding and laughed at my presentations, and called me the man who chases ghosts, had known I was right the entire time. They had simply decided that the truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. One document stopped me cold. It was a Vrael military report, 12,000 years old, buried under 3 layers of encryption, that had taken the fleet's best codebreakers 6 hours to crack at my request. It described an engagement between a Vrael colonial expedition fleet and an unknown force of bipedal beings in a region of space that corresponded exactly to the current exclusion boundary. The engagement lasted less than 1 standard rotation. The Vrael fleet consisted of 80 warships and 300 civilian transports carrying colonists. The unknown force consisted of 4 ships. 4 ships destroyed 80 Vrael warships and then escorted the civilian transports safely to the nearest inhabited system without harming a single non-combatant. The report's author, a Vrael fleet commander whose name had been redacted, described weapon systems that operated on principles his engineers could not identify and defensive capabilities that rendered Vrael ordnance completely ineffective. He described ships that moved through space as if the laws of physics were suggestions they had chosen to politely decline. The final line of the report had not been redacted. It was written in old Vrael formal script, the kind used for warnings that were meant to survive the collapse of civilizations. It read, "Do not seek them. Do not provoke them. Pray they have forgotten us." I read that line 4 times. Then I opened the next file, and the next, and the next, and each one was worse than the last. A Dothuri deep ocean temple contained carvings that depicted their earliest space explorers encountering ships that moved without engines, vessels that simply appeared where they wished to be, as if distance were an inconvenience rather than a physical law. The Dothuri had tried to communicate. The ships had responded by repairing a radiation leak in the Dothuri vessel's reactor that the Dothuri themselves had not yet detected, transmitting the repair schematics in a data format so elegant that Dothuri engineers were still trying to fully understand it 12,000 years later. Then the ships had left. No demands, no threats, no follow-up contact of any kind. Just a casual, almost absent-minded act of kindness from an intelligence so far beyond the Dathuri that helping them was apparently no more difficult or noteworthy than stepping over a crack in the pavement. The Alon records were stranger still. Their atmospheric archives contained vibration patterns from 9,000 years ago that described a period their historians called the Silence, a span of approximately 300 years, during which the Alon detected a sustained artificial signal emanating from beyond the exclusion boundary. The signal was not communication, it was music. Someone on the other side of that line had been broadcasting music into the void for 3 centuries, and the Alon, whose entire culture was built around the interpretation of sound and vibration, had listened to it and understood none of it, and been so profoundly affected by its complexity and beauty that they had classified the entire experience as a religious event and forbidden further discussion. I put the last document down and walked to the observation deck and stared at the exclusion boundary, that vast wall of supposedly empty space that every species in the galaxy had been taught to avoid since the dawn of their respective space programs. It was not empty space. It had never been empty space. It was not a region of gravitational anomalies or sensor distortion or navigational hazards. It was a border. Someone had drawn a line across the galaxy 14,000 years ago and had enforced it with such absolute consistency that every civilization that encountered it simply accepted it as a natural phenomenon, because the alternative was too enormous and too terrifying to contemplate. Someone had been sitting on the other side of that line for 14 millennia, and now they were moving. On the 9th day, the fleet's long-range sensor arrays began detecting organized movement beyond the boundary. Not the vague shapes from the original probe data. Clear, structured formations, thousands of distinct energy signatures, arranged in geometric patterns, so precise, they looked algorithmic. They were not hiding. They were not approaching with stealth or caution. They were advancing in what I could only describe as parade formation, moving with the unhurried confidence of an entity that had no reason to fear anything it might encounter. Every ship in the Confederate fleet went to maximum alert. Weapons systems charged, shields activated, fighter squadrons launched and formed screening lines. I watched the entire defensive apparatus of 9 civilizations snap to readiness in a matter of minutes, and I thought about 4 ships destroying 80 Vrael warships 12,000 years ago, and I felt something that went beyond fear into a kind of hollow resignation. Then the communications array picked up a transmission. It came from beyond the boundary, broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. At first, it was not language. It was mathematics, a counting sequence. Prime numbers, delivered in a steady pulse that any civilization with basic numeracy would recognize as artificial. Then geometric proofs, then physical constants. The speed of light expressed in multiple unit systems, as if the sender was establishing a shared mathematical vocabulary from first principles. 20 minutes of mathematical introduction. The entire war chamber listened in absolute silence. Chirrut Voss stood motionless, his combat eyes fixed on the communications display, his mandibles locked in the Vrael posture of total concentration. Then the mathematics stopped, and a voice spoke. It used Vrael trade language, the simplified commercial dialect that the Vrael had used for interspecies commerce for millennia. But it used an old version, very old. The grammar was formal to the point of being archaic, the vocabulary drawn from a dialect that had not been in common use for thousands of years. It sounded like someone who had learned the language from a textbook that was written before the Confederacy existed. "We are the Terran continuity," the voice said. "We request dialogue. We will hold position at the boundary for 6 of your standard rotations. If no dialogue is initiated, we will proceed regardless." Proceed regardless. The war chamber erupted. Representatives shouted over each other. Military commanders demanded clarification of rules of engagement. The Alon delegates' pressure sphere pulsed so violently that safety protocols activated and began venting excess energy. Ambassador Christ shattered 2 decorative panels with a harmonic stress emission she could not control. Proceed to do what? Invade? Attack? Occupy? The message offered no context, no explanation, no demands. Just a deadline, and an implication that what came after the deadline would happen, whether we cooperated or not. I stood at the edge of the chaos and watched the sensor displays update in real time. The formations beyond the boundary were still growing. More signatures appeared behind the first wave, and then more behind those, cascading backward into the dark like a tide that had no shore. I pulled the latest density estimates and ran the numbers on formation spacing and mass signatures. 6,000 was the estimate from the probe data 9 days ago. The current count was past 8,000 and still climbing. I felt the blood drain from my face as I watched the number tick upward, signature by signature, each one representing a warship larger than anything in the Confederate fleet. I thought about the Vrail report, 4 ships against 80. Now we were looking at thousands upon thousands against our 2,200. I did not know what proceed regardless meant, but I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like cold water, that if the beings on the other side of that boundary decided to proceed, there was nothing in the Confederate combined fleet, nothing in all the combined military power of 12 spacefaring civilizations that could do a single thing to stop them. The diplomatic shuttle launched on the 4th day of the 6-rotation deadline. I was aboard because nobody could think of a reason to leave me behind, and several people could think of reasons to bring me along. Chief among them, the fact that I had spent more time thinking about the species we were about to meet than any living being in the Confederacy. Whether my thinking was accurate remained to be seen, but it was all anyone had. High Commander Chirrut Voss came personally, which was either brave or fatalistic, depending on your interpretation. Ambassador Christ represented the Cytherea, her crystalline body cycling through colors I had never observed before. Frequencies that her species produced only in states of extreme emotional complexity. A Dothuri linguist named Finar Gol occupied the shuttle's rear compartment, his translation equipment taking up more space than the rest of us combined. We crossed the exclusion boundary at the 2nd hour of the 4th rotation, and nothing happened. I want to be very precise about this because it matters. We crossed the line that had killed every ship that had touched it for 14,000 years, and absolutely nothing happened. No gravitational distortion, no sensor interference, no weapons fire, no energy barriers, no spatial anomalies of any kind. The shuttle passed through the boundary as if it were not there, because it was not there. It had never been there. The boundary was not a wall. It was a courtesy, a line drawn in empty space that said, very simply, this side is ours and that side is yours, and we have chosen not to cross. Chosen. For 14,000 years they had chosen. And every species in the galaxy had looked at that choice and seen a natural disaster instead, because the idea that someone could enforce a border across 8% of the galaxy's circumference for 14 millennia through pure voluntary restraint was so far beyond our frame of reference that our minds simply refused to process it. On the other side of the boundary, a ship was waiting for us. I had studied descriptions of Terran vessels in every ancient text I could find. The Vrail accounts described them as angular and dark, like geometric wounds cut into the fabric of space. The Dothuri histories called them light-eaters, ships that seemed to absorb the radiation around them rather than reflect it. The Cytherea cave paintings showed shapes that were simultaneously precise and organic, as if someone had engineered a predator and then given it the soul of a cathedral. None of those descriptions were adequate. The ship that hung in the void before us was larger than anything I had ever seen, not larger than the largest Confederate warship, though it was that. Larger in the sense that it occupied space with a kind of authority that made everything around it feel temporary. Its hull was dark, not black but a deep shifting gray that seemed to drink in the light from distant stars without reflecting any of it back. It was covered in geometric patterns that I initially took for decorative elements, before realizing they were functional. Weapon ports, sensor arrays, shield emitters, drive components, all integrated so seamlessly into the ship's structure that the vessel itself was the weapon. There was no distinction between the ship and its armament. They were the same thing. We docked. The interior of the ship was not what I expected. The corridors were wide, well lit, and finished in materials that were warm to the touch. There were plants growing in alcoves along the walls, actual living vegetation, green and delicate, and completely out of place inside a warship that could presumably destroy continental surfaces from orbit. I saw artwork on the walls, paintings, sculptures, objects that served no military purpose whatsoever, displayed with obvious care in a vessel that was built for war. Then I saw the humans, and every myth I had ever studied became insufficient. They were bipedal, as the texts described, endoskeletal, with their structural framework hidden beneath layers of soft tissue and covered in exposed skin that showed every vein, every muscle movement, every subtle shift in blood flow. They had forward-facing eyes, the universal marker of a predator species, set in faces that were mobile and expressive to a degree that was almost overwhelming. I could see their emotions moving across their features like weather patterns, shifting and blending and transforming faster than I could catalog them. They were small, shorter than the Vrail, slighter than the Dothuri in their natural form, fragile-looking, in a way that made the ancient texts' descriptions of their combat capabilities seem almost absurd, but they moved with a fluid efficiency that I found deeply unsettling, every motion calibrated and purposeful, as if their bodies were instruments they had spent their entire lives learning to play with absolute precision. They were not hostile. This was the thing that surprised me most, given what I had read and what I had feared. They greeted us with calm professionalism, guided us through the ship with careful courtesy, and spoke to us through a translation system that was so sophisticated it captured not just the meaning of their words, but the emotional context behind them. I noticed details that no ancient text had recorded. Their hands. They had 5 digits on each hand, each one capable of independent articulation, and they used them constantly when they spoke, gesturing and pointing, and emphasizing with a physical vocabulary that was almost as complex as their verbal one. Their skin changed color in response to emotional states, flushing darker when embarrassed or agitated, paling when shocked. They smiled, pulling their lips back to expose their teeth in what I initially interpreted as a threat display, before realizing it was the exact opposite. They showed their weapons to indicate they meant no harm. The contradiction was so perfectly human that I did not even find it surprising. I noticed the way they looked at us, not with fear or hostility or superiority, but with curiosity. Genuine, intense, almost childlike curiosity. They studied our biology, the way I studied their myths, with the fascination of someone encountering something they had only read about. One of the escort officers, a young man with dark skin and careful eyes, kept glancing at Ambassador Christ's crystalline structure with an expression of barely contained scientific wonder, and when Christ noticed and turned toward him, he did not flinch. He smiled at her. A Cytheri ambassador who could shatter steel with a harmonic pulse, and he smiled at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Their delegation was led by a woman who introduced herself as Fleet Marshal Elaine Marsh. She was of average height for her species, with close-cut gray hair and eyes that held the particular quality of focus I had seen in career military officers of every species I had ever studied. She looked at us the way a surgeon looks at a patient, with compassion and clinical precision in equal measure. "Thank you for crossing the boundary," she said, and I noticed that she used the Vrael word for boundary rather than her own. A small gesture of linguistic respect that was not lost on Chirrut Voss. "I know it was not an easy decision." "You know nothing about our decisions," Chirrut Voss replied, and his voice carried the formal edge of a Vrael commander addressing a potential threat. Fleet Marshal Marsh looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something I did not expect. She nodded. "You are right. I apologize. That was presumptuous." A Vrael High Commander had just been rude to the representative of a civilization that could presumably annihilate the entire Confederacy, and her response was to apologize for being presumptuous. I felt something shift in my understanding of the situation, some fundamental recalibration of the model I had built in my head. She led us to a conference room that overlooked the void through a transparent wall that spanned the entire width of the ship. Stars glittered in the dark beyond the glass, and I could see, very faintly, the distant glow of the Confederate fleet's drive emissions on the other side of the boundary. Fleet Marshal Marsh sat across from us and began to speak, and what she told us took the mythology I had spent my career studying and replaced it with a truth that was infinitely larger and infinitely stranger. Humanity existed in the galaxy long before the Confederacy, long before any of the 12 member species achieved spaceflight, long before most of them achieved industrialization, 14,000 years ago, humans had been a galaxy-spanning civilization, with technology so far beyond anything the Confederacy currently possessed that comparison was not meaningful. And 14,000 years ago, they had fought wars with several of the species that would eventually form the Confederacy. Young species, just beginning to reach beyond their home systems, encountering a civilization that had been old when their ancestors were still learning to use tools. The wars had been brief and completely one-sided. Humanity won every engagement with such overwhelming force that the outcomes were never in question. But the victories troubled them. Fleet Marshal Marsh described this with a quiet gravity that I found more compelling than any dramatic oration could have been. Humanity had realized that their very existence distorted the development of every civilization they contacted. Species did not grow in the presence of a power so vast that resistance was meaningless. They either submitted and became dependent, losing the capacity for independent development, or they fought and were destroyed. There was no middle ground. Humanity's presence in the galaxy was, by its very nature, a force that prevented other species from becoming what they had the potential to become. So humanity made a decision that I found almost incomprehensible. They left. They withdrew behind the exclusion boundary, sealed themselves off from the rest of the galaxy, and let every other civilization evolve without interference. For 14,000 years, they sat on the other side of an invisible line and watched. They watched the Vryle build their military empire and then transform it into a democratic federation. They watched the Dothuri master deep space navigation. They watched the Cytheri develop energy crystal technology. They watched the Alon create communication systems based on atmospheric harmonics. They watched 12 species find each other, fight each other, negotiate with each other, and eventually form the Confederacy of United Species. And they never intervened, not once. "You have been watching us," Chirrut Voss said, and his voice was flat with a controlled fury that I recognized as the Vryle response to a perceived violation of sovereignty, "for 14,000 years. "Yes," Fleet Marshal Marsh said simply. "You watched our wars, our famines, our plagues. You watched civilizations collapse and species nearly destroy themselves, and you did nothing. Yes. Why? Because it was not ours to fix. Because every crisis you survived made you stronger. Because the Confederacy that exists today, the one that assembled 2,200 warships in 36 rotations to face an unknown threat, could not have existed if we had intervened every time things became difficult. You built something extraordinary, High Commander. You built it yourselves, and that is the only way it could have value." Chirrut Voss stared at her for a long time. His mandibles worked silently, processing something that I do not think he had the framework to fully articulate. "Then why are you here now?" I asked, because someone had to, and because I had been carrying that question since the moment I matched the probe's energy signatures to a 14,000-year-old cave painting. Fleet Marshal Marsh turned to me, and for the first time I saw something in her expression that went beyond professional composure. I saw worry. Deep, genuine, personal worry. The kind that keeps you awake at night and follows you through every waking hour. "Because something is coming," she said, "that will end all of you." She activated a display on the conference table, and a holographic projection filled the space between us. It showed the galaxy from above, a spiral of light and dust and gravitational complexity that contained every world and every species and every civilization I had ever known. And beyond the galaxy, moving through the intergalactic void with the slow inevitability of a geological process, something else. The humans called it the recursion. It was not a species. It was not a civilization. It was a self-replicating consumption wave, a vast front of machines that stripped solar systems to raw material and used that material to build more of themselves. It had no culture, no language, no negotiating position, no desires that could be bargained with or appealed to. It consumed, it replicated, it moved on, and it was heading directly for the galaxy at a speed that would bring it into contact with Confederate space in approximately 18 months. Fleet Marshal Marsh explained that humanity had encountered the recursion once before, in a distant galaxy, millions of years ago. They had barely survived. The experience had fundamentally shaped their civilization, driving their technology and their military doctrine and their entire philosophical framework around a single organizing principle: survival. The Confederacy, as it currently exists, cannot survive contact with the recursion, she said. Your combined military capacity is insufficient by several orders of magnitude. Your technology, while impressive for its age, does not include the tools necessary to counter a self-replicating consumption wave. You will be overwhelmed within months of first contact. The words hung in the air of the conference room like a diagnosis of terminal illness. I looked at Chirek Voss, at Christ, at Fenar Gol, in his translation cradle, and I saw the same expression on all of them despite the vast differences in their biology. The expression of someone who has just been told that the world they know has an expiration date. We are not here to ask your permission, Fleet Marshal Marsh said. We are informing you that we are going to fight the recursion when it arrives, and we are offering you the opportunity to participate in that fight. You can cooperate with us, or you can stay out of our way. But we are not leaving this galaxy undefended. The shuttle ride back to Confederate space was the longest journey of my life, despite lasting only 40 minutes. I stood on the observation deck as we crossed the boundary and re-entered the defensive perimeter of the Confederate fleet, and then I stayed there as Fleet Marshal Marsh's deadline expired and the boundary opened. Not cracked, not breached. Opened, like a curtain being drawn back from a window by someone who had been standing behind it for 14,000 years. And behind it, filling the void from horizon to horizon, in every direction the eye could reach, was the full strength of the Terran continuity. 10,000 dreadnoughts. I need you to understand what those words mean, because numbers alone cannot convey it. Each ship was larger than the largest capital vessel in the Confederate fleet. Each one was identical to the others in silhouette, but I would later learn that no two carried the same weapons configuration. They were arranged in a formation so precise that the mathematical relationships between their positions formed geometric patterns visible to the naked eye, perfect tessellations of triangles and hexagons and shapes I did not have names for, stretching across a volume of space that dwarfed the entire Confederate defensive line. Their drives lit the void white. Not blue, not red, not the familiar colors of any known propulsion system. White. Pure, undifferentiated light, as if each ship carried a star in its engine room and had simply decided to let it shine. The sensor systems aboard the Mandate of Chirek overloaded and rebooted 3 times in the first 30 seconds. The navigational computer flagged 4,000 separate collision warnings before someone manually disabled it. I stood on the observation deck and watched 10,000 suns being born at once, and I understood in a single moment of terrible clarity why every ancient text described humans with the language of mythology. Because mythology was the only framework large enough to contain what they were. The Confederate fleet reacted with chaos that was entirely predictable and entirely useless. Some species immediately broadcast pledges of cooperation. Others demanded emergency legislative sessions. The Dothuri ambassador, who had called the entire situation fabricated hysteria, went completely silent and did not speak again for 3 days. 2 species attempted to withdraw their ships from the defensive line, and Chirek Voss had to issue direct orders to prevent the formation from collapsing entirely. The Vrail High Commander stood beside me on the observation deck, watching the human armada pour through the opened boundary in an endless river of light and steel and impossible power. He was the most decorated military officer in Vrail history, a veteran of 60 years of service, who had commanded fleets in 3 separate conflicts and never lost an engagement. He stood there in silence for a long time, watching, and then he said something that I wrote down immediately, because I knew it would be the most important thing anyone said on that day. We thought we were the galaxy's apex predators, he said quietly. We were pets in a garden they planted. Fleet Marshal Marsh sent a galaxy-wide broadcast 1 hour after the boundary opened. It was transmitted in every known Confederate language simultaneously, delivered with a precision that meant the humans had studied not just our languages, but our cultural contexts, our rhetorical traditions, our emotional associations with specific phrasings. It was a masterwork of multilingual communication, and it carried the weight of 14,000 years of patience. People of the Confederacy, we are humanity. We are not your enemy. We are not your rulers. But something is coming that will end all of you, and we will not allow it. Stand with us. or stand aside. Either way, we are here. 3 months after the boundary opened, I moved aboard the dreadnought Remembrance of Autumn as the official Confederate liaison to the Terran Continuity Fleet. I volunteered for the position because I believed someone needed to document what was happening, someone who understood the historical context and could record events with the precision they demanded. The truth was simpler than that. I was a man who had spent 20 years chasing a myth, and now the myth was real, and I could not bring myself to watch it from a distance. Living among humans was an education in contradictions that never resolved and were never meant to. They were predators. Their biology made this undeniable. Forward-facing binocular vision, canine teeth designed for tearing flesh, musculature optimized for pursuit and grappling, adrenal systems that could flood their bodies with combat-ready hormones in fractions of a second. They had evolved on a world that was, by any reasonable standard, hostile to life. High gravity, extreme temperature variations, an atmosphere laced with a corrosive gas they called oxygen, which they breathed voluntarily and continuously. Their home world was populated by millions of species that had spent billions of years evolving increasingly sophisticated methods of killing each other, and humans had emerged from that environment as the dominant predator by being more adaptable, more persistent, and more creatively violent than anything else on their planet. And they kept pets. This was the first contradiction I encountered, and it set the tone for everything that followed. The crew of the Remembrance of Autumn included over 40,000 humans, and a significant number of them maintained small animals in their quarters. Not livestock, not working animals bred for specific tasks. Companion animals, creatures they fed and groomed and spoke to in soft voices and worried about when they showed signs of illness. I watched a gunnery officer who could calculate firing solutions for weapons that could crack planetary crusts, sit on the floor of her quarters, and let a small, furry animal with enormous eyes climb onto her shoulder and fall asleep against her neck. They waged war with mathematical precision and then wept over individual casualties. This was not performative grief. I was present at enough memorial services to recognize the difference. When a human died, the people around them experienced genuine, devastating emotional pain that manifested in physiological responses I could measure with standard medical equipment. Elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep patterns, reduced appetite, diminished cognitive function. They mourned the way my species mourned, with a depth and sincerity that I found simultaneously reassuring and deeply troubling, because it meant that the beings who had built 10,000 world-killing warships felt every death as a personal wound. They had weapons that could crack planetary crusts, and they decorated their quarters with paintings of flowers and landscapes and images of children playing in fields. They listened to music, complex arrangements of organized sound that served no survival purpose whatsoever, and that they valued with an intensity that suggested it was as essential to them as food or air. I heard a human engineer humming while she repaired a torpedo launcher, a soft melody that had nothing to do with warfare, and when I asked her about it, she told me it was a song her mother used to sing to her when she was small. I watched that same engineer, a woman named Claire Dunning, repair a hull breach on a fighter craft. The breach was on the exterior of the ship. She went outside in nothing but a pressure suit that provided thermal insulation and oxygen, but no radiation shielding, and no micrometeorite protection. She worked in hard vacuum for 6 minutes, her exposed skin freezing, and then healing in real time, as her body's cellular repair mechanisms fought to keep pace with the damage. Human biology could do this. Not comfortably, not safely, but it could be done, because human cells carried repair mechanisms that were, by the standards of every other species I had studied, obscenely aggressive. Damage occurred. Damage was repaired. The process was painful, visible, and relentless, like everything else about them. That night, I passed Claire Dunning's quarters and heard her voice through the door. She was talking to her daughter over a long-range communication channel, reading a bedtime story. She was doing different voices for the characters, making her daughter laugh, being gentle and silly and warm in a way that bore no resemblance to the woman who had welded hull plating in vacuum 6 hours earlier. This was what the myths could not capture. The ancient texts described humans as forces of nature, as entities of pure destruction, as beings who existed outside the normal rules of biological limitation. And those descriptions were not wrong, but they were incomplete in a way that mattered more than I had imagined. Humans were not one thing, they were everything, simultaneously, all the time. They contained predator and parent, warrior and artist, destroyer and builder, all compressed into a single biological framework that somehow maintained coherence despite carrying contradictions that should have torn it apart. I found them beautiful. I found them terrifying. I could not look away. The recursion was detected at the galaxy's edge, 5 months after the boundary opened. Long-range probes, launched by the Terran continuity into intergalactic space, returned data that I spent 3 days analyzing before I fully understood what I was looking at. The recursion was not an army. It was not a fleet. It was a process. A self-replicating wave of machines that consumed matter, energy, and information with the mindless efficiency of a physical law. It had been moving through the intergalactic void for millions of years, stripping galaxies to raw material and using that material to build more of itself. It had no strategy because it needed none. It simply advanced, consumed, replicated, and advanced again. The probes showed it strip mining a dwarf galaxy in its path, peeling apart stars and planets and asteroids, and converting them into copies of itself with an efficiency that approached thermodynamic perfection. Within weeks, the dwarf galaxy that had contained 3 billion stars was a cloud of debris and freshly minted recursion units, each one ready to consume the next thing it encountered. The scale was beyond anything I had a framework to process, and the leading edge of this wave was 18 months from Confederate space. I attended a briefing where a human tactical analyst named Peter Hollis walked the Confederate liaison team through the recursion's projected approach vector, and I watched the faces of the alien officers in the room as they grasped, one by one, what they were looking at. The Vrail tactical commander gripped the edge of the briefing table until the metal deformed under his claws. A Cytheri weapons specialist went completely transparent, her crystalline body losing all opacity, as her stress response overwhelmed her ability to maintain normal light refraction. The Dothuri liaison officer excused himself and did not return for 2 hours. Peter Hollis delivered the entire briefing with the calm, measured tone of someone discussing logistics rather than extinction. I asked him afterward how he maintained that composure. He looked at me and said, "Because panic does not change the math. The math says we fight, so we fight. Everything else is wasted motion." It was the most human thing anyone had said to me since I had boarded the Remembrance of Autumn, because it was simultaneously completely rational and completely irrational. The math said they fight, as if mathematics had opinions, as if equations could make moral demands. But the humans believed it, all of them, with a conviction that turned a cold numerical analysis into something that burned with purpose. Human war doctrine against the recursion was unlike any military strategy I had ever studied. The recursion adapted. This was its central capability and its greatest threat. Every weapon used against it was effective exactly once. The first time you deployed a particular type of weapon, it worked. The recursion units in the blast radius were destroyed, and then the surviving units analyzed the weapon's operating principles, redesigned their own defensive systems, and became immune to that weapon within hours. By the time you fired it a second time, it did nothing. The human response to this was staggering in its ambition. No 2 dreadnoughts in the 10,000-ship fleet carried identical weapon configurations. Each ship was armed with a unique combination of offensive systems, many of which operated on principles I could not comprehend even after having them explained to me. The tactical doctrine was not to find the best weapon and mass-produce it. The doctrine was to hit the recursion with 10,000 different weapons simultaneously, so that it could not adapt to any single approach before the next approach was already being deployed. The Confederacy, humbled and frightened and desperate to contribute something meaningful, offered what it could. The Vrail provided their sensor networks, the most sophisticated detection grid in Confederate space, capable of tracking objects across light years with precision that even the humans acknowledged was impressive. The Cytheri contributed their energy crystal technology, power storage systems based on crystalline matrices that could hold and release energy at densities that exceeded human capacitance technology in certain narrow applications. The Dothuri offered their deep space navigation expertise, charting escape corridors through gravitational complexities that would allow civilian populations to evacuate if the battle went badly. Humanity accepted everything, graciously, without hesitation, with a genuine appreciation that I initially mistook for politeness, before realizing it was something more. They integrated Confederate technology into their war plan immediately, finding applications and synergies that the contributing species had never considered. And I began to understand something that reframed my entire understanding of why humans had withdrawn from the galaxy 14,000 years ago. They had not left because they were afraid of what they might do to us. They had left because they needed us to develop independently, to create technologies and capabilities and perspectives that humanity itself did not possess. The Vrael sensor networks were better than human sensors in specific ways. The Sci-Theory crystals could do things that human power systems could not. The Dothuri understood gravitational navigation at a level that human navigators found genuinely novel. 14,000 years of independent development had produced 12 species with 12 unique sets of capabilities, and humanity needed every single one of them for what was coming. They had planted a garden and waited for it to grow, because they knew that one day they would need what the garden produced. The first engagement with the recursion happened at the outer edge of the galaxy's spiral arm, in a region of thin stellar density that the human commanders had chosen specifically because it minimized the recursion's access to raw material for self-replication. There were no speeches, no dramatic charges, no final words of inspiration broadcast to the fleet. The 10,000 dreadnoughts simply moved, repositioning with a coordination that made the Confederate fleet look like a collection of unrelated objects drifting in the same general direction. Every ship knew where every other ship was. Every ship knew what every other ship was doing. The fleet moved as a single entity with 10,000 components, and it moved with a speed and precision that I had not imagined was possible for objects that large. I watched from a shielded observation post aboard the Remembrance of Autumn as the first wave of dreadnoughts engaged the recursion, and what I saw rendered language inadequate. Weapons that folded space, collapsing the distance between the dreadnought and its target to zero, and delivering destructive energy at point-blank range from thousands of kilometers away. Weapons that reversed entropy locally, causing recursion machines to age millions of years in seconds, their components corroding and disintegrating as time itself turned against them. Weapons that generated fields where the physical constants that the recursion's machines depended on simply stopped applying. Regions of altered reality where circuits could not conduct and processors could not compute, and structural materials lost their integrity because the rules that gave them integrity no longer existed. One dreadnought deployed something I could only describe as a wound in the concept of physics itself, a region of space where the recursion's machines simply ceased to function, not because they were destroyed, but because the framework of natural law they operated within had been locally suspended. They drifted, inert and purposeless, like toys abandoned by a child who had decided the game was over. The recursion fought back. It fought with the blind, relentless efficiency of a process that had been consuming galaxies since before humanity existed. Waves of machines surged against the dreadnought line, adapting in real time, evolving countermeasures, and developing new attack patterns with a speed that was genuinely shocking. Within the first hour, it had already developed partial resistance to 3 of the weapon types deployed against it. 3 dreadnoughts died in the first engagement. I watched them die. 3 ships, each carrying over 40,000 humans. The first one took a concentrated recursion assault that overwhelmed its shields through sheer volume of attack. Thousands of recursion units physically swarming the hull and disassembling it from the outside in. The ship fought until its reactor core was exposed, and then it detonated itself to prevent the recursion from capturing its technology. The explosion destroyed everything within a radius that my instruments could not adequately measure. The fleet adjusted in real time, not retreating, not mourning, learning. Every destroyed ship's combat data was absorbed by the fleet network instantaneously, and the strategies that had killed those ships were flagged and retired before the debris had finished cooling. Humanity treated its own losses as information, and every death made the surviving fleet more effective. I found this the most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed. Not because it was cold. It was not cold. The crew of the Remembrance of Autumn held a memorial service that night for the fallen ships. Every name was read aloud. Every single one, from every ship. Over 120,000 names. It took 4 hours. People wept. People held each other. People stared at the wall with expressions that carried a grief so profound it seemed to have physical weight. And the next morning, they went back to war. The recursion adapted faster than projected. 5 days into the engagement, it split its main body into 3 prongs, each one flanking the human formation from a different vector, attempting to bypass the dreadnought line and reach the resource-rich stellar systems behind it. If it reached those systems, it would have access to the raw material it needed to replicate exponentially, and the war would shift from difficult to unwinnable. Fleet Marshal Elaine Marsh sent a fleet-wide signal that consisted of 2 words: Phase 2. I asked my human liaison, a tactical officer named Simon Hale, what Phase 2 meant. He looked at me with an expression I had learned to recognize as the human version of grim resolve, the particular set of the jaw and narrowing of the eyes that humans produced when they had made a decision that would cost them dearly, and had accepted that cost without hesitation. It means we stop being careful, he said. Phase 2 was not a battle. It was a revelation. I stood on the observation deck of the Remembrance of Autumn and watched the 10,000 dreadnoughts undergo a transformation that I had not known was possible, that no intelligence report or sensor scan or cultural analysis had prepared me for, that violated my understanding of engineering and physics and the basic limitations of material reality. The ships reconfigured. Hull plates shifted, sliding across each other like the scales of a living organism, revealing structures beneath that had been hidden since the fleet first emerged from behind the boundary. Weapon arrays extended from compartments that should not have been large enough to contain them, unfolding from compressed spatial dimensions that the ships had been carrying inside themselves like seeds waiting to germinate. The ships themselves grew larger, their hulls expanding outward as internal spaces that had been folded into higher dimensional configurations unfurled into normal space. The dreadnoughts that the Confederacy had seen, the ones that had already dwarfed every warship in the known galaxy, the ones whose drives had turned the void white and whose formation had stretched across light years of space, those had been the restrained version. Those had been 10,000 warships operating at a fraction of their actual capacity, holding themselves back with a discipline that I now understood was not military restraint, but something closer to compassion. They had been gentle, because they were entering a galaxy full of civilizations that might be frightened, and they had not wanted to frighten anyone more than necessary. Phase 2 was humanity deciding that the time for gentleness was over. The battle entered a phase that I cannot fully describe because my sensory apparatus was not equipped to process it. Space-time buckled, not metaphorically. The fabric of reality in the combat zone developed visible distortions, regions where light bent and stars flickered, and the void itself seemed to ripple like the surface of disturbed water. The recursion, which had consumed an entire dwarf galaxy without slowing, which had been advancing through the universe for millions of years with the unstoppable momentum of a natural law, began to retreat. For the first time in its existence, it retreated. I watched a single dreadnought, the weight of memory, break formation, and charge directly into the heart of the recursion's central prong. It moved with an acceleration that should have killed every living thing aboard through sheer gravitational force, but humans had solved that problem so long ago that the solution was apparently not even worth mentioning. The weight of memory reached the densest concentration of recursion units and detonated something that I cannot describe with any existing scientific vocabulary. A volume of space 3 light minutes across simply ceased to contain anything. The recursion machines in that volume did not explode. They did not disintegrate. They did not burn or melt or fracture. They unexisted. They were simply no longer there, as if the space they had occupied had been edited and the content removed. My instruments registered the event as a localized drop in the total mass energy content of the observable universe, which should have been impossible, which was impossible, and which happened anyway, because the humans who built that weapon had apparently found the rules of reality to be more flexible than the rest of us had assumed. The weight of memory survived. It flew out of the void it had created and rejoined the formation without pausing. Its hull scorched and its external sensors burned away, but its core systems intact. The crew had done what they did, and they had lived, and they were already preparing to do it again. Other dreadnoughts deployed their own unique weapons, and the combat zone became a gallery of destruction, so varied and so creative that it defied any single description. The constant shore projected a beam of coherent gravitational force that compressed a column of recursion units into a filament thinner than a hair and denser than a neutron star. The patience of rivers released a swarm of countermachines, human-designed self-replicating units that consumed recursion material and converted it into inert dust, fighting the wave's own strategy against it. The seventh winter generated a field of absolute thermal cessation across a volume of space larger than most planetary orbits, dropping the temperature to a fraction above absolute zero and freezing the recursion's molecular processes into immobility. Each weapon worked exactly once at full effectiveness. Each weapon bought time, and time, in a war against an enemy that adapted to everything, was the most valuable currency in existence. The humans spent it wisely, rotating their attacks in sequences that were calculated to maximize the gap between deployment and adaptation, never giving the recursion enough data on any single weapon type to develop a complete countermeasure before the next weapon type was already in play. The Confederacy played its role in the battle, and I say this without false modesty, because it mattered more than anyone on either side expected. The Vrail sensor networks identified recursion adaptation patterns in real time, tracking the wave's evolutionary responses to each weapon type and feeding that data to the human fleet so that commanders could sequence their attacks for maximum effect. The Cytheri energy crystals powered a network of interdiction stations that projected fields inhibiting the recursion's self-replication processes, slowing its ability to replace destroyed units by a factor that the human tacticians described as strategically significant. The Dothuri navigators plotted evacuation corridors for civilian populations, charting safe passages through gravitational complexities that allowed the relocation of billions of people from threatened systems. For the first time in the war, it felt like a genuine partnership between humanity and the Confederacy. And standing on the observation deck of the Remembrance of Autumn, watching Confederate technology operate alongside human weapons in a coordinated assault that was saving the galaxy, I understood at last why humanity had done what they had done 14,000 years ago. They had not needed to leave. They could have stayed, could have ruled, could have shaped every species in the galaxy into useful servants or loyal allies. But they had not wanted servants or allies. They had wanted partners. They had wanted 12 species, with 12 unique sets of capabilities, developed independently, over thousands of years, bringing perspectives and technologies that humanity itself could not have produced, because no single civilization, no matter how advanced, could think of everything. They had planted a garden and waited 14,000 years for it to grow, because they knew that when the recursion came, they would need more than just their own strength. They would need the combined creativity of every mind the galaxy could produce. And the only way to get that was to let those minds develop freely, without interference, without guidance, without the suffocating shadow of a civilization so advanced that its very presence made independent thought irrelevant. It was the most generous strategic calculation I had ever encountered, and it had taken 14,000 years to execute. The recursion's central processing nexus was identified on the 11th day of Phase 2. It was a structure the size of a small moon, buried deep within the consumption wave, surrounded by the densest concentration of recursion units in the entire formation. It was the closest thing the recursion had to a brain, the coordination hub that managed the wave's adaptive responses and directed its replication processes. Destroy the nexus, and the recursion would lose its ability to adapt. Without adaptation, it was just machines. Very dangerous machines, but machines that could be fought with conventional means. Fleet Marshal Elaine Marsh ordered the assault. 700 dreadnoughts formed a spearhead and drove into the heart of the recursion wave. The spearhead formation was shaped like a blade, narrow at the leading edge and broadening toward the rear, with the most heavily armed dreadnoughts at the front, absorbing the brunt of the recursion's counterattack, while the ships behind them prepared their nexus-targeting weapons. I watched the formation accelerate into the consumption wave, and disappear into a wall of recursion units so dense that it blocked starlight. For 11 seconds, I could see nothing. The sensor feeds showed only static. The tactical display went dark. Silence filled the observation deck of the Remembrance of Autumn, and in that silence, I heard my own heartbeat and the breathing of every officer around me, and nothing else. Then the feeds came back, and the spearhead was still advancing, burning its way through the densest concentration of hostile machines in the galaxy, through sheer force and coordinated firepower and the absolute refusal to stop. I watched them go, and I want to record what I saw with the precision it deserves, because I believe this was the moment that defined humanity more clearly than any myth or any ancient text, or any 14,000-year-old cave painting ever could. 700 ships flew into a wall of self-replicating machines that had been consuming galaxies since before their species existed, and they did not slow down. The recursion threw everything it had at that spearhead. Waves of units crashed against the dreadnought formation like breaking surf, swarming and adapting and evolving in real time, developing new weapons and new strategies with every passing minute. Dreadnoughts began to die. I watched the casualty counter on the tactical display climb. 40 dreadnoughts destroyed, 60, 90. Each number represented a ship with a crew of over 40,000 people. Each number was a city dying in the dark between the stars. I felt physically ill. My digestive system rebelled against the sustained horror of what I was witnessing, and I had to grip the railing of the observation deck to keep my legs from failing. The spearhead did not slow down. 90 dreadnoughts lost. 100, 110, 3,400,000 human lives erased from existence in less than 2 hours, and the surviving ships closed ranks and kept advancing, filling the gaps left by the fallen, and pressing forward with a determination that went beyond courage into something I did not have a word for. They reached the Nexus. The coordinated weapons discharge that followed was something I cannot describe with any accuracy, because my instruments could not measure it. The tactical display showed energy readings that exceeded its maximum values, and then showed nothing at all, because the sensors that fed it had been burned out by the intensity of what was happening. I saw light. Not the light of weapons fire, or engine drives or explosions. Light that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the fabric of space itself had briefly become incandescent. The Nexus cracked. The recursion wave shuddered. Across a front that spanned thousands of light years, the self-replicating machines stuttered. Their movements became erratic. Their adaptation cycles failed. Their replication processes ground to a halt, as the coordination signals from the Nexus degraded and collapsed. Within hours, the recursion units began to drift, still dangerous, still armed, but no longer directed, no longer adapting, no longer functioning as a unified wave. The battle was not over. Mopping up the remnants would take months. Sterilization fleets would need to hunt down every fragment and every drifting unit and every dormant seed that the recursion might have scattered across the combat zone. But the wave itself, the galaxy-consuming process that had been advancing through the universe for millions of years, was broken. The cost was staggering. 614 dreadnoughts destroyed, over 15 million humans dead. In a single campaign lasting less than 3 weeks, humanity had suffered losses that exceeded the total military casualties of the entire Confederacy across its 600-year history. I attended a memorial service on the Remembrance of Autumn on the evening after the Nexus was destroyed. The entire crew assembled in the ship's largest compartment, a cavernous space that I had been told was designed specifically for gatherings of this kind, as if the ship's architects had known from the moment they laid the first hull plate that this room would be needed. Every name was read aloud. Every single name, from every destroyed ship. 15 million names. They did not read them all that night. They could not. It would have taken weeks. But they began, and the reading would continue, a few hours each day, until every name had been spoken into the air and heard by living ears. I stood at the back of the compartment and watched these people, these impossible, contradictory, terrifying, beautiful people, hold each other and weep for their dead. Warriors who had fought a machine apocalypse without flinching, who had flown their ships into the face of annihilation and kept fighting through losses that would have broken any other civilization I had ever studied. stood in that room and cried. Not silently, not with restraint. They wept openly, holding each other, their bodies shaking with a grief that was as raw and as real as anything I had ever witnessed in any species. The myths got it wrong. Every ancient text, every cave painting, every crystal-encoded memory from 14,000 years ago described humans as invincible, as forces of nature, as beings who existed outside the normal limitations of biology and mortality and fear. They were not invincible. They bled. They grieved. They died. They lost 614 ships and 15 million people. And every single one of those losses left a wound in the survivors that I could see in their eyes and hear in their voices and feel in the quality of silence that filled the corridors of the remembrance of autumn in the days after the battle. They were not invincible. They just did everything, including dying, without stopping. In the weeks that followed, as the sterilization fleets hunted recursion remnants and the galaxy slowly began to process what had happened, fear began to spread through the Confederacy. Not fear of the recursion, fear of humanity. The threat was gone, but the beings who had eliminated it were still here, and they were so far beyond the Confederacy technologically and militarily that the concept of resistance was laughable. Some species began talking about preemptive submission, offering tribute, restructuring the Confederacy to give humans a permanent governing position. Others advocated for immediate military buildup, as if a few hundred years of weapons development could close a 14,000-year technological gap. The old patterns emerged, the patterns that every civilization falls into when confronted with a power it cannot match. Submit or fight, bow or resist, become servants or become enemies. I watched these patterns develop and felt a deep, weary sadness, because I knew something that the frightened diplomats and panicking military commanders did not. I knew it because I had lived among humans for months. I had watched them fight and grieve and repair hull breaches in vacuum, and read bedtime stories to their children over long-range communication channels. I knew what they were going to do next, and I knew that nobody in the Confederacy would believe it until it happened. Fleet Marshal Elaine Marsh addressed the Confederate Council one final time, 6 weeks after the destruction of the recursion nexus. She stood before the assembled representatives of 12 species, a small woman with gray hair and tired eyes, and she spoke without notes and without ceremony. The Terran Continuity Fleet would be withdrawing to the exclusion boundary. The boundary would be re-established. Humanity was leaving. The council sat in silence so complete that I could hear the hum of the ventilation system 3 floors above us. Fleet Marshal Marsh continued speaking into that silence, with the quiet patience of someone who had expected this reaction and understood it completely. They had not come to rule. They had not come to conquer. They had not come to take the place they could so easily have claimed at the head of the Confederacy. They had come because something threatened the galaxy they had been watching over for 14,000 years, and now that the threat was gone, they were going back to their side of the line. She left one gift, a communication relay, installed in a permanent orbit around Solaris Prime. If the Confederacy ever faced a threat beyond its capacity to handle, it could activate the relay and send a message across the boundary. Humanity would answer. They would always answer. But the day-to-day business of running the galaxy, of building civilizations and solving problems and making mistakes and learning from them, that belonged to the Confederacy. It always had. Humanity's role was not to lead. It was to watch, and to wait, and to come when called. "You are not our subjects," Fleet Marshal Marsh said. "You are not our children. You are our neighbors, and we are proud of what you have built. Keep building. We will be here if you need us." She turned and walked out of the chamber, and within 72 hours, 10,000 dreadnoughts had crossed the boundary and disappeared into the space beyond it. The boundary re-established itself, invisible and absolute, and the galaxy was quiet again. I returned to my archive on Solaris Prime. My office was no longer in the sub-basement. They had given me an entire wing of the Central Authority's Historical Division, with a staff of 40 researchers and a budget that would have made my former self weep with disbelief. The Terran hypothesis was no longer a hypothesis. It was the most important field of study in the Confederacy, and I was its foremost authority, the man who had chased ghosts until the ghosts turned out to be real. I sat at my new desk, in my new office, surrounded by artifacts and translations and documents that represented the work of a lifetime, and I began to write the definitive history of humanity's return. I started with the truth that no myth had ever fully captured, the truth I had learned by living among them and watching them fight, and watching them grieve, and watching them withdraw from a galaxy they could have owned with a word. Humans were never myths. They were gardeners. They planted a galaxy full of species, drew a line around it, and watched from the dark for 14,000 years, waiting to see what would grow. They did not interfere when we struggled. They did not intervene when we suffered. They let us make our own mistakes and find our own solutions and build our own civilizations, because they understood something that none of us had grasped until they showed us. The only strength that matters is the strength you build yourself. And when something came to burn the garden down, they did not send diplomats. They did not send warnings. They did not send advisors or consultants, or technical assistance packages. They sent 10,000 dreadnoughts, and they paid for the garden's survival with 15 million of their own lives. And then they left, because the garden was never meant to be theirs. It was meant to be ours. I wrote the final line of my introduction on a quiet evening, with the lights of Solaris Prime glittering through my office window, and the communication relay orbiting silently overhead, a small mechanical promise hanging in the dark sky like a star that never moved. They were never gone. They were always watching. And we, all of us, 12 species scattered across a galaxy we thought we owned, were always theirs to protect. I set down my stylus and looked out at the stars, and somewhere beyond the boundary, beyond the invisible line that separated their world from ours, I knew that 10,000 ships were watching, patient, silent, ready. They had been there for 14,000 years. They would be there for 14,000 more. And if anything ever came for the garden again, they would answer. They would always answer. Because that is what humans do. They hold your hand, and they burn a star. And they weep for both, and they never, ever stop.